Having a calculator on hand might be helpful. Doing math for me is not, how I spend my free time. I was definitely liberal arts background. So I am a visual learner. I'm going to try to keep this as visual as possible. I tend to draw a picture before I have to do any math. So that's where I'm going to start with this. And hang in there. And like I say with everything, don't go too far down any rabbit holes. There's not going to be more than a few questions on the exam. It varies from year to year how much focus there is on these kinds of questions. But I think if you are taking the exam, my best strategy, I think, was to go through and just answer all the low-hanging fruit, go through the exam, skip anything that I had to think more than a few seconds about, and then I got 80% of the way through all of the questions in a shorter period of time, and then it felt like I was able to really spend time on the head scratchers and know that I had more time instead of being stressed while trying to answer them. So these are definitely the types of questions that you'll probably skip over first and then come back to and feel like you've got a little bit of time to think about it. So I'll do my best to give you some hints on how to approach these questions and explain the concepts clearly. Nathan, as usual, I'm going to be full screen with my presentation. I'll share it here in just a second. I'm not able to see the chat box, if any. So if you need me to stop and clarify, or if something's not making sense, do chat or alert Nathan, and I'll have him interrupt me verbally if I can help anymore. Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and here we go. So I just wanted to revisit this concept, which is geared towards what affects the amount of moisture in a finished cheese. So what is driving the variability, and why would we want to measure it, and what importance does that have in achieving the target sensory attributes that you're going for in a cheese? So as a reminder, if you haven't caught the first two presentations, definitely go back and listen to those recordings. But the main concept here is that when you are cutting your curds and stirring your curd, that's going to have a big influence on how much moisture is retained in your finished curd. So the larger you start with your curd cut, if you cut your curd for the first time to walnut-sized pieces, you're going to be retaining a lot more moisture in those curds than if you were cutting to a rice or a lentil-sized piece. And so you'd end up with a harder cheese the smaller you cut that curd, and you end up with a softer cheese with more potential for softening during ripening. When you have those big, juicy, walnut-sized curds, chances are your cheese is going to start out a little rubbery and then continuously soften over the ripening period, sometimes quite dramatically. The more moisture it is, the faster it moves, and the more textural change you're going to see during ripening. The harder your cheese is, the more consistent the texture is going to seem from start to finish. Broadly, but on the palate, you really notice even a hard cheese change over this point of ripening. It starts out maybe rubbery or chalky, and then it becomes smoother and creamier over time. So that curd size is important because it affects the amount of surface area on that curd for moisture to escape. So the smaller it is, the more surface area there is, and the more quickly you'll lose the moisture. So that's the size. And then you've got the role of acidity and moisture retention. So you have to remember that once you break that big curd mass for the first time, you make those cuts, you've now created a clear separation between your curds and your whey. The whey is where all the active lactic acid bacteria and lactose are hanging out. So the curds do have some of that kind of trapped inside, but the way to think about it is the curd is now like a distinct chunk that's floating around in a porridge of actively acidifying soup. And so all the food for the lactic acid bacteria and all the lactic acid bacteria are really concentrated in that whey. So the contact of the curd to the whey is affecting how acidic that curd is getting. And as that happens, as a curd bobs around in the whey, the calcium that's gluing those curds together and giving them structure, helping to bind the proteins into that spongy meshwork that's trapping water and fat globules, that glue, that calcium holding those proteins together, is going to start dissolving more and more rapidly as that acidification continues. So the more exposure your curd has to that acidifying whey, the more demineralized it will be, the more you're leaching those minerals out because you're dissolving it in an increasingly acidic solution. So as you demineralize curd, you are creating more pathways for moisture to escape. Your curd will dry down more quickly, and you're losing potential elasticity in your curd. Depending on the recipe, you have a target amount of elasticity. It's not just straight up always a bad thing to lose those minerals. You could have a cheese that's too rubbery and never really breaks down and is creamy on the palate. It's kind of bouncy and chewy. That curd, maybe you could have benefited for a little bit more time bobbing around in that way and softening it so that it could have a more pleasant feeling on the palate. So it's really a spectrum, and the timing at which you remove those curds from the whey is extremely important to achieving that target texture you're going for, whatever that is, whether you're going for a crumbly cheese or a smooth bendy cheese. Okay, so let's get into it then with all that in mind. One, non-fat in the what now? So there's two different ways that questions could be asked. And I think it's probably fat in dry matter is where the questions are going to be geared, because that relates to single, double, and triple cream questions and standards. But there's two sides to the coin. So best way to preface this is when we make a cheese, we want to know how much of that total cheese is moisture. How well did we hit our moisture targets? So that seems obvious, right? How much we're trying to capture a certain amount of water. How much did we capture? We do that in-house. It's a very simple test. It's a little scale, no bigger than a dinner plate. And you put 10 grams of cheese on the scale and you close the lid. The lid has a heating element that dries that cheese out. So you started with 10 grams and then it'll beep when it can tell the scale is no longer losing weight. And what that's doing is it's measuring evaporative moisture loss. So it's drying down the samples and we can tell it's dried it completely out. It's not losing any more weight. It'll ding and flash the percentage of weight on the screen, which is the percentage that was water that was evaporated away. So it's not a super expensive piece of equipment, all things considered, and we can have interns running him all day long. So we get these readings all the time. That's great. We want to know the moisture content, but it doesn't tell you everything. Two cheeses with the same amount of moisture could have a really different texture. That's something we're going to talk about on the next slide. The two cheeses with the same amount of moisture could have a different texture. And that's because it's not just moisture and everything else that matters. It's really the ratio of moisture to protein. And fat is somewhat inert. It's like other. So the texture of a cheese really depends on how much protein there is to bind in the water and fat. And if you have more moisture and less protein, you're going to have less structure because there's more space for the protein to try to fill and grab on and hold everything in. So that's important. We're really looking at a three-way relationship, a pie chart that's split between water, fat, and protein. Okay, so we talk about it in cheese making technical terms, fat, moisture, and dry matter. And dry matter includes minerals, salts, everything else, but for the most part, it's protein. Okay, so here we go. Let's say that this wheel of Bailey Hazen Blue, which is what we're looking at here, a freshly spiked wheel, just going into the caves. This is the age that we would take a test on. And you can see kind of in the lower right-hand quadrant of the wheel, there's like a blotch, a little circular blotch. That's actually a trier hole where we used a core, took a core sample, and did a moisture and probably fat reading on that core. And then we put it back in, and since it's a blue cheese, it's supposed to have an open texture. We're okay if it's got some holes in it. Okay, so let's say we've got this fresh wheel of cheese. It's 100 grams. It actually is a lot more than that, but whatever. This is an imaginary math problem. Okay, and let's say that of that 100 grams, we have 50 grams of water. So as a percentage, that's 50%, right? That's why I made it 100, just to make this, take it easy on ourselves. And let's say in this theoretical 100 gram sample of cheese, there's 25 grams of protein. So looking at this and knowing there's really only 3 parts to the pie, how much fat are we expecting to see on the next slide here? So if there's 100 grams total, there's 50 grams water, there's 25 grams protein, that's going to leave 25 grams of fat. That sort of deductive reasoning and simple algebra is the basis to how all of these questions will be asked. So it's this is the main chart that you're going to want to look at and think about. So when you get asked a question about fat and dry matter, draw this wheel of cheese. Draw a little bar graph and always put water on the bottom. Water flows downhill. Always put fat on the top. Fat floats to the surface, and kind of keep protein in the middle, because we're always talking about the relationship of fat to protein or protein to water. So it's easier when you're trying to solve to keep that protein in the middle. Okay, so all of the things that aren't fat is called the non-fat substance. That's totally logical, right? The 2 parts of the pie that are not fat is the non-fat substance. The 2 parts that is not water is called the dry matter. You guys with me? This is I love that they named it so simply. When you hear dry matter, you're just looking at, what is the part of the pie that is not the moisture. And as you can see, protein is in both of these ratios. So you're always looking at the relationship between protein and something else, one other thing. Okay, so the percentage of water in non-fat substance is really what we're looking for here, because that protein to water ratio really tells us the most about the texture and the ripening trajectory of the cheese. So the moisture in non-fat substance is the percent of water in all of the parts of the cheese that's not fat, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's the percentage of the total of water that's not including the part that's fat. So to solve this problem, what percent of non-fat substance is the water? The answer is on the screen right now. I'm going to talk through it. So as a percentage, what percent of the total non-fat substance is water? So let's talk about it in terms of the number of grams. I find it easier to do math when we're looking at grams, rather than if I put up on the screen 50% water, 25% protein, 25% fat. That's harder for me to wrap my head around and solve around than converting it to grams. So I always want to draw the picture. They're always going to give you 2 of the 3 parts of the pie, and it's going to be simple deductive reasoning to be able to assign a number to another part. All right, so drawing this chart on your test scrap paper is going to really help you stay calm and just think through what it is they're trying to ask. So let's do this together. How many grams of things are present that's not fat? That's the protein and the water. So that's 75 grams is the non-fat substance, the total non-fat substance. So what percent is 50 grams of that 75? So just looking at it proportionally, it's 2/3, right? 2/3 of the total amount there. 50 parts water, 25 parts protein. So to express that in a percentage, you divide what you want to know as want to express as the percent by the total, right? So it would be 50 divided by 75 is going to give you a percentage. So 50 divided by the water divided by the water plus the protein parts is going to give you that 67%, which is 2/3 expressed as a percent, right? So logically, you can kind of look at this and say, yeah, that's about 2/3, and then you do the math and you're like, yep, that percentage matches, all right? So that moisture and non-fat substance, that's probably not going to be on the test. You'll be happy to hear. I don't know if I've heard of that, but these two concepts are inextricably linked to each other. And so I thought it was important to explain it, and you never know when that type of question is going to pop up on the test. So when our cheesemakers go around and say like, oh, we hit our moisture target at 60%, our head cheesemaker Mateo is like, what's the MNFS? That your percentage of water doesn't tell you anything. And we're going to look at that on the next slide. Okay, so the fat and dry matter here, it's the same type of thing. So you're trying to solve for FDM. So as we'll see in the coming slides, triple cream cheeses, single cream cheeses, double cream cheeses all have a target FDM number. And that's what makes them categorized in one of those three classifications. So fat and dry matter is much more likely the type of question that you're going to have to answer, and probably as it relates to those. So the concept here is, what's the percent of fat for all non-water parts, right? So just looking at this, I think we can do this in our heads. What percent of the total cheese that isn't water is the fat here? So put your hand over the screen where the water is. How many parts are we looking at? 25 parts fat, 25 parts protein, so that's 50 total grams of non-water stuff. What percent of that 50 grams is the fat? So what percent is 25 grams of 50 grams? It's half, right? We're looking at, it's half and half fat, half protein. Of the non-fat substance, we're looking at a 50% dry matter. Oh, good, that's the answer. So I hope that makes sense. And it's not much more complicated than that. So if you understand, what this concept means, fat and dry matter, then a test question could be, okay, you have a 100-gram sample, 50 grams of its water, 25 grams of its protein, what's the fat and dry matter? And you'd be able to solve that. And the best way to solve it would be to draw the picture and put in the numbers as you know them. Or it could be a really tricky approach to the question could be, you've got a cheese, it's 50% dry matter, and there's 50 grams of water. So how many grams of fat are in this 100-gram sample? And you can get there if you draw the picture and just go through the logical steps of what that means. But the math won't be any more complicated than just figuring out a percentage and just knowing what the percentage is, okay? So here's a great example of why moisture content is garbage on its own. It doesn't really tell you anything. So I actually made this slide for the Jasper Hill cheesemakers at the behest of Mateo, because he kept trying to explain this, and it's complicated. So these two cheeses, it's a picture of Constant Bliss, our lactic set cheese. So this is definitely a real world thing we were working on. They both have the same moisture target, and that's typical. And also I should mention that in this last slide, this is pretty real life what Bailey's percentages are. That's a typical moisture MNFS percent for Bailey and FDM, fat and dry matter. So that's kind of, that's theoretically possible. There's probably a batch of cheese in our caves that's exactly this. Okay, this is more typical for a soft cheese, more moisture per everything else, right? Higher moisture percentage. But look at these two cheeses. They have the same parts per total, that is water, which is 60 parts of the total. And they have really different moisture and non-fat substance scores and really different ripening trajectories. So the one on the right is going to be gooier and creamier and softer, and the one on the left is going to be hard and chalky and boring, even though they have the same amount of water technically in them. Same number of ounces of water. So what's going on here? It's that one of them has more protein to hold everything together, and the other has less protein as a percent of the total to hold everything together. So on the left, we've got 30 parts of protein that have to hold in 70 parts of everything else. And then on the right-hand side, we've got only 20 parts to hold in 80%. So the the total proportion is actually quite different. The moisture and non-fat substance is 75% for the right, and it's only 66% on the left. So even though they have the same percent moisture, they have really different moisture and non-fat substance numbers and really different ripening trajectories, if that makes sense. So we're ignoring the fat part and just taking a ratio of water to protein, and that's really what matters the most. Okay, so if your fat is fluctuating seasonally, if your minerals are fluctuating, if you're losing fat to the whey because it's damaged and you end up with less of it than you'd think, that's going to affect your final product. Everything is connected in cheesemaking, and there's never just one problem. It's always connected to something else. So let's look at this example and do some problems that would be similar to what you might find on the test. So the answers to the thing you need to memorize here is the chart and what fat and dry matter means. So take the water out of the equation if we're working on fat and dry matter, as the name implies. We're only talking about dry matter. And the fat as a percentage of all non-water parts, okay? So you need to know what that is. Then you need to know the single cream, double cream, and triple cream percentages. So when I first started learning about cheese, I thought that a triple cream, I knew that, I'd heard or whatever, I was learning about cheese, and I'd memorized the fact that triple cream was 75% fat. And then I learned that butter is 80% fat. So I'm like, wait a minute. So is a triple cream basically just butter, but it has such a different texture? It's more watery. There's more, there's definitely protein there. So what is this about? With butter, the percent of butter fat is figured as a total. So when we say butter is 80% fat, that is 80% of the total is fat. When we're talking about cheese, we're talking about fat and dry matter. So it's 80% of the non-water parts are fat. So these cheeses are not 75% fat. They are it's a much lower number than that. It's probably more like 30%. But we're only talking about it in fat and dry matter. Why would we do that? That seems confusing. Why wouldn't we just talk about fat as a percent of the total and just like make it simple for everybody? Well, with a cheese like this specifically, you make the cheese, it weighs 100 grams. The first thing that you do when you ripen it, and let's say it's got 20 grams of fat in it, okay? So we had this cheese, it's 100 grams, even though it's much smaller, it also weighs 100 grams. It's got 20 grams of fat. That's 20% fat, right? That's great. Why can't we just start tracking it there? Well, the first thing you do with a cheese like this is put it into a drying room and zap 20% of the moisture out of it. That's just the way you make the cheese. It's too wet. A lactic fat cheese is too wet. You put it in a drying room, you remove a lot of the moisture, and then all of a sudden, what was 20 grams of fat and 20%, because now the whole thing weighs 80 grams, it's now 25%. Right? Or something like that. You've increased the percent of fat of the total if it loses moisture. And it's losing moisture even after you take it out of the drying room and put it in the caves. All cheese has like a 15 to 25% shrink rate from the day it's made to the day it's sold. It's going to vary depending on the cheese style, but it's slowly dehydrating over the course of its aging. All of those flavors, all of the components are getting concentrated. And so if you have a target of a 20% fat cheese, that percentage is going to change every day as that moisture changes. So it's not useful to talk about fat as a percent of the total because the total weight fluctuates so much during ripening. So that is the reason why you're always talking about fat and dry matter, to actually give an understanding of how much butter fat there is in relation to the protein, okay? So a single cream cheese is anything with less than a 60% fat and dry matter. The double cream has a fat and dry matter reading of between 60 and 75%. And then a triple cream is anything that's 75% or more fat and dry matter. So not as a percentage of the total, but as a relation of fat to protein. Okay. So let's say this theoretical cheese has 20 grams of protein and 60 grams of water, right? That all adds up to 100, 60, 20, 20, yeah, 60, 40. So what is the fat and dry matter of this cheese? All right, so not including the 60 grams of water, we're just looking at the 40 grams, it's not water. What percent of 40 grams is the fat? This is another easy one, it's 50%, right? And then it's 75% moisture non-fat substance, and that's interesting. So we can, kind of cover up the fat here. What percent of the total non-fat moisture and non-fat substance is the water here? What's percent of moisture and non-fat substance? So that would be what percent is 60 out of a total of 80. Okay, we're going to add the non-fat parts together. 60 plus 20 equals 80, and then we're going to divide 60 by 80, and that's going to give us 75%. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So, all right, we're going to move on here to the next example. So in this example, the test might say you have a cheese that's 60%, that has a 60% FDM score, or they might say, well, let's start here. You got a cheese that's 60% fat and dry matter, and you have 27 grams of fat. Okay, so from that information, you could tell the test how many grams of protein and how many grams of water there are if you knew that the cheese weighed 100 grams, right? So in this case, you would need to figure out, what number 27 grams is 60% of. Okay, that's algebra. Brush up on that. We're going to do that calculation later on in this presentation, so stay tuned, but that's the way you would solve this, right? You know that 27 is 60% of the total number. And so what you would do is find out what total number 60% is, 27 grams is 60% of. Then you would know that fat plus protein equaled that big number. You'd subtract 27, and then you'd be left with a number of grams of protein, which is 18. So that tells me that 27 is 60% of 27 plus 18, right? And then from here, if we knew this was a 100-gram piece of cheese, then you just subtract those two numbers from 100 and you'd see 55 grams of water. So if the test it just needs to give you the fat and dry matter and one component of the total, and you can figure out the other two. It just needs to give you two pieces of information and you can solve the whole puzzle. In this case, let's say you've got a triple cream cheese, it's 75% fat and dry matter, and it tells you there's 44 grams of water, or it tells you there's 44, it's 44%. I would turn that right into grams right away. Create your imaginary 100-gram piece of cheese and assign that number. And so if you were told it's 75% fat and dry matter, then that tells you there's 66 grams left. That's not water, that's the dry matter. All right, so we're looking at this. We're like, okay, if I know it's 75% fat and dry matter and I know there's 44 grams of water, that leaves 56, sorry, grams of other things. And then what number is 75% of 56? Right? So you do the algebra and you can get to the place where you know that 42 is 75% of 56, if that makes sense. So if you can do those percent calculations and you can draw this picture, you're going to be in good shape. And like I said, save it to last, give yourself enough time, and don't sweat it because there's only going to be one or two of these. But I hope that makes sense. So the way I built this slide, I actually didn't know this before I started, but I went on a nutrition website and I it's like for dieting, and you can put in brands of cheese. And so I plugged in, a couple brands of double cream cheese I could think of and triple cream cheese. And then it will tell you the number of grams of fat and protein per serving. And you could set it to 100-gram sample. And so I was able to just Google it and see exactly how many grams of fat and protein were in typical double and triple cream cheeses. And then I did the math and I was like, wow, yes, they are legally selling that as a triple cream because they told me how many grams of fat and how many protein there were, and the percentages worked out. So these are based on actual cheeses on the marketplace. This is not so theoretical. This is what a typical um, fat and dry matter and MNFS score looks like. And so to myself, I was thinking like, oh man, if you're just cramming more and more fat into these cheeses, and if your water stayed the same, what would happen? You know what I mean? So if you had a 60 gram, the theoretical recipe that would have a target of 60% moisture, and then you kept adding more fat to it, what would that do to the protein? It would get smaller and smaller, and the cheese would fall apart. So what you have to do when you're making a triple cream cheese is actually lower your moisture target as a percent of the total. So you might be targeting 60% on a single cream soft cheese, but in a triple cream, if you had 60% moisture, there would be basically no protein left. And all you would have is like a watery, fatty puddle. It would be not marketable. So what's happening here is you're reducing the amount of water, you're reducing the amount of non-fat substance, but keeping the proportion of moisture in non-fat substance the same, if that makes sense. So you can see that MNFS score is pretty steady. It's a little bit higher in a triple cream cheese for whatever reason on average, but it's right around that 75, 76% mark. So you're trying to keep a cheese with the same amount of structure, the same ratio of water to protein as you increase the fat, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know that before I tried to make this slide to do an educational thing for CCP. But it totally makes sense. If you want to keep that integrity, you've got to reduce both of them in proportion to balance out that fat. Okay, so this seems like a weird way to switch gears, but now we're going to talk about marketing and specifically navigating a supply chain and understanding margins in a supply chain. So that might not be what you think of when you think of marketing. You might think of a glossy print ad, but a lot of marketing is understanding how to price your products throughout the supply chain and how to create good relationships throughout the supply chain. And interestingly, the types of calculations that you do to figure a margin are the same exact calculations that you do to figure the fat and dry matter. So we're gonna, that's why we put these on the same presentation, because it's the same math problem actually. So if you can do one, you can do them both. I'm gonna kind of zip through the like theoretical, philosophical aspect of how to manage relationships properly and really just focus on the math of margin calculation. And I might not get all the way through this presentation, but the important mathy parts will get covered. So basically the premise here is that as a cheesemaker, your goal is to get people to eat the cheese and give you money. And that sounds simple, but it gets more and more complicated the more real life you introduce into this equation. So if you're a cheesemaker and you're making a natural rind artisan cheese, $25 a pound is, I think, a very fair price. And that used to be high 10, 15 years ago. And now I would say that's mid to low price per pound that you'd expect for an artisan farmstead cheese with a natural rind, right? So usually more towards 30, in between 30 and 40 these days, especially if you're talking about non-cow or blended milk cheeses. Okay, so it seems great as a cheesemaker to say, well, if my cheese is worth $25 a pound on the market, fair market value, then I want that $25 a pound. I want it all. And that's great. You could go to the bank and say, I can make this product and I can sell it for $25 a pound. And they're going to be like, wow, that's a great plan. But what does it cost you? What's it cost to make? Well, you can say, well, it only cost me $5 a pound to make, and that's an 80% gross margin. And that banker is going to be like, sweet, sounds good. Here's some money. But you aren't taking into account really the cost of selling that cheese. Selling cheese directly to a consumer, as you know, as cheese retailers, is very time consuming and expensive. It takes a lot of labor, it takes shrink, it takes training to do it right, and it takes a lot of transactions to sell 10 pounds of cheese. So that's what this presentation is, sort of the thesis of it, but it also has some math baked in. So how did I figure this out? The cost of goods, $5 a pound. That is low for some cheesemakers, but as we know, like block cheddar, the commodity price that a large scale cheddar producer would be charging a distributor is like $2.50 a pound. So it must cost them at least a little bit less. You'd hope it would cost them a little bit less than that to make. So $5 a pound sounds really low to cheesemakers, like artisan cheesemakers, and pretty high to commodity cheesemakers. For us at Jasper Hill, $5 a pound is a pretty fair representation of the cost of getting the cows milked, getting the cheese made by the creamery, purchasing the cheese from our own creamery or from a partner creamery, and leaving them a little bit of profit, enough to cover their operations. So basically a green piece of cheese that has not been aged, sold, or marketed, doesn't have any of that admin cost figure, just getting a fresh piece of cheese onto a shelf in the cave, that's $5 a pound. And then that $5 a pound piece of cheese does tend to retail for $25 a pound. But we are not making an 80% gross margin, I will tell you that. So how did I figure out what that 80% margin is? This is an important concept that I did not understand when I was hired by Jasper Hill to be in charge of sales and marketing. Mateo had to make me a sticky note that looked like this top part here. And I still have this sticky note. It's very precious to me. Basically, there's a difference between markup and margin. And I was conflating the two in my head. And he was like, oh man, here we go. Okay, I need to explain this to you. And I was like, yes, please. I have a liberal arts background. So a margin is the amount of the total sale price that you keep that's not your cost. All right. And so if you are selling a cheese for $25 and it costs you $12.50 to make it or to buy it from your cheesemaker, then 50% of that sale is your profit, right? That's different than a markup. If you bought a piece of cheese for $12.50 and you put a 50% markup on it, that's taking 50% of the purchase cost and adding it to the purchase cost. So that would be taking $6.25, right, and adding it to $12.50 and getting to $18.75 or whatever it is. But basically you're ending up with a 33% margin if you mark up a percentage of the cost, as opposed to figuring out that you want to keep half of the total sale price, which is what a 50% margin is. So that's the way that I organize language. And when you hear people talking about putting a margin on something, they're talking about doing the math to figure out how to keep X percent of the total sale as a ratio with the cost. So if we're talking about a 25% sale at a farmer's market direct to the consumer, and it only costs us $5 to make it, what percent of the total is that green part that's showing there? So just like when we're doing the butter fat, instead of looking at a bar chart with percentages, I like to do it with actual numbers, putting the numbers on there. So the total sale price is 25. What percent of that total? So first I'm going to assign a dollar value to the green part, and then I'm going to do the math instead of trying to think of it as a percentage. So if the total is 25 and the cost is 5, what's the green part here? It's 20, right? Draw the bar graph, put your knowns, label your knowns, and then you can get there logically if you understand the vocabulary of what's being asked. So in this case, it's the price minus the cost equals the percent margin if you know the sale price and you know your cost, right? So you're subtracting $5 from 25 and you're getting your 20, and then you're dividing that profit margin by the total, right? So you're going to end up with 20 divided by 25 is going to give you 80%, right? So $20 is 80% of $25. That's what we're ending up at. So if somebody says, what's your profit margin if you buy it for 5 and you're selling it for 25, you draw this chart and you figure out as a percentage what that green part is of the total. What percent is 20 of 25? You divide 20 by 25 and you get the 80% gross margin. Okay, so that's one way that this question would come at you. So the thing to keep in mind is that when you're selling at a farmer's market, it's not, it's usually not a super efficient way to sell, right? You are selling by the ounce. you've all had customers saying, can I buy 2 ounces of this cheese? And when they're looking at the price tag and you're like, I can't physically cut you a 2-ounce piece of cheese. Usually 4 ounces is the minimum, but customers are trying to buy as few ounces as possible with a really expensive cheese. And so you're selling by the ounce, you're not selling by the pound. And so I did the math, and for a 45 cow farm, a 50 cow farm, you would need to do 400 half-pound transactions a day to sell that much cheese. 50 cows can make like 75,000 pounds of cheese. And if you were selling that all a half pound at a time, and you were selling cheese 365 days a year, you would have to sell 400 half-pound pieces a day from just 50 cows. That's like a normal to small size herd of cows. So you might think this keeping the $25 a pound is a great idea, but what army of people are you going to have to pay to make 400 transactions a day? I do know cheesemakers who will do this if they are in proximity to the market. Excuse me. So if you're near New York City green markets, and you can have 10 different sites set up all over the city, and you have 20 part-time workers, you might be able to get to that 400 transactions a day, but you are managing a large staff of people. Okay, so it's just about decision making. How much of your time do you want to spend transacting? How many people do you want on your sales team? Mateo is able to basically do all of the sales work himself as the cheesemaker for 50 cows by selling farther back into the supply chain. They never, at Jasper Hill, we live in the middle of nowhere. We go to the farmer's market, 8 people might come that day. So selling direct to consumer in person was just not an option. There's just not enough people around us to have made that work. So from the beginning, they structured the business to accommodate other people in the supply chain. And they didn't have, this is, back when dial-up internet days and before a web store was really a realistic way to sell direct to consumer. So they were selling directly to retailers and chefs. And so that price, if they knew that this cheese they were making had an end customer value, a fair market value of $25 a pound, they couldn't sell it to the retailer for $25 a pound because that retailer needs to make money on it too, right? And that retailer, especially if they're buying whole wheels and cutting it to order, they're going to be putting a 50% margin on it. So if they're buying something for $10, they have to sell it for $20 to cover all of the labor and overhead, keeping the lights on in the store, keeping people paid, keeping that shrink number afforded. It's expensive. So if you want that retailer to sell for $25 a pound, or if you are selling at the farmer's market, but then you pick up your local store in town and you were selling it at, you're selling it for $25 to the customer, and then your customer walks into the retailers and you sold it for $25 to them, it's going to cost $50. And what's that customer going to say? Oh, the retailer is ripping me off. The poor retailer is just doing their job and trying to get by. So you've made your new buddy who can buy 10 pounds of cheese at a time instead of 8 ounces look like a real jerk. So you want to be able to back out that margin and be able to know what somebody's going to what margin each person in the supply chain is going to need to take. So what am I going to sell it to this retailer knowing that they're going to take a 50% margin if I want to keep the end customer paying the same amount? So this math, just looking at it, if you know the retailer is going to keep half of the total sale and you want them to charge $25, what are you going to charge the retailer? I think even without doing an equation, we can see that it would be $12.50, right? You sell it to the retailer for $12.50, they take a 50% margin, meaning they keep 50% of the total sale of $25. That leaves $12.50 for their cost. I hope that makes sense. We'll look at it with a slightly harder math just to do the math on this. So let's say that this retailer takes a 55% margin. That's typical. That is not considered out of the question. I would expect anywhere from 45 to 60% margin for a service counter. Usually like cut and wrap and grab and go might get you under 50%, but if somebody is like hand cutting and wrapping cheese, 50 is the minimum I would expect. Okay, so let's say here we've got we need to figure out what to charge this new shop customer of ours. We want them to charge we want them to charge $25 a pound, and we ask them, hey, what's your margin? And so we can figure out what to charge you. And they say, yeah, we put a 55% margin on things. Okay. So first thing you do is figure out what the green chunk is as a dollar figure. So what is 55% of 25? Then we can figure out, we can subtract that number from the total, right? And figure out what that cost would need to be to get it to the customer at $25 with that 55% margin. So again, as just a bunch of numbers on the page, I would totally choke on an exam. But drawing this picture and being like, oh, yeah, well, all I have to do is figure out how many dollars that green part is and then subtract that green part from the total. And it'll tell me what the gray part is. Okay, I can do this. Draw the chart. So price is 100% minus, this is a little bit harder way to do it, but this is the formula. You could also do it by figuring out what percent of the total the gray part is. So in this case, it's 45%, right? So 100% minus that gross margin is going to tell you that the cost is 45% of that target price. So the amount you need to charge is 45% of that $25 you want them to charge. So what's 45% of 25, right? It's $11.25. Either way, whether you leave the percentages in place or whether you convert it to total dollars, the math is fairly simple on this one, backing out that margin and knowing what to charge somebody. Okay, so that's great. In this case, it's a 60% margin, right? We are charging the retailer $12.50 now to keep our end price steady. It still costs us $5 to make it. So $5 cost with a $12.50 sale price leaves what's now our margin? It's not 80% anymore. It's 60%. And the way that we get to that is by figuring out how many dollars the profit is. So $12.50 minus $5 gives you the profit. Divide the profit by the total of $12.50, and that gives you 60%. So that would be $7.50 divided by $12.50. It's going to give you that 60% number. All right. So not such a good number, but still not bad. But, you're still looking at, like, let's say instead of a half pound, you are selling 10 pounds. So you're still having to make 20 sales a day of a 10-pound wheel to a retailer. You might be able to do that. You might be able to have still a lot of sales work to do, especially if you're getting on the phone and then FedExing to the retailer. That's still a lot of sales work if you're trying to sell 50 cows worth of cheese 10 pounds at a time to retailers. Some retailers are going to do better than that for you. Maybe they'll buy 20 or 30 pounds, but it's still, when you break it down like that, what is the cost per pound of the transaction? How many hours is it going to take per pound to move this? That's when you start to understand what value the distributor brings. Also, because when you retail, like ship directly to that retailer, you're either getting in your car and driving it to them, which takes your time, is more valuable than anything as a cheesemaker, and you're using gas and depreciating your car or whatever. And it's a hot summer day and the cheese isn't that happy. You might invest in a refrigerated truck. Okay, that's a big overhead expense. Or you're using UPS, which is much more typical, and that's going to cost 30 to 50 bucks a box easy. So that's adding several dollars a pound onto the cheese. So your cheese is probably going to end up retailing for more than $25 a pound when that retailer factors in the freight that they pay, or you eat it on the freight, and that actually, your cost of doing business is lower. You're spending a few bucks a pound and on shipping and only charging $12.50, then you're not really making a 60% margin, and you're doing all of the sales work. So when you start to look at this math, it makes sense why cheesemakers would want to work with a distributor, even if they don't have a huge program. Just with 50 cows, it's exhausting to do the sales work. So a distributor brings a lot of value because they have the overhead of running all of those trucks, having all those drivers, having all those inside sales agents, processing all those POs. So instead of processing, 140 transactions per week of those 10-pound sales to those cheesemakers, you're processing one PO a week and sending a pallet. And it's going on a refrigerated truck and staying in much better condition than it would getting kicked down the stairs by the UPS guy. No offense, UPS guys. Thank you for bringing me all of the things I need right now. Okay. So a distributor is going to take 20% easy. That is just an industry standard, and it's going to go up or down depending on the specific type of distributor and the specific type of customer the distributor is selling to. But we always figure, when we're trying to figure out, like, all right, if we want to make sure this cheese stays under $40 a pound on the counter, we always factor in a 50% retailer margin and a 20% distributor margin to figure out what we're going to charge distributors to aim for that $40 SRP. So that's why I would do all of this math. And this is the most frequent type of math that I do, the equation we're going to look at next, because as a cheesemaker, I'm always trying to project out what my cheese is going to cost later on in the supply chain, and trying to figure out what to charge a distributor to hit a target SRP. So if a distributor is working with a independent retail shop, maybe they can drop off 5 shops worth at a time, maybe just one. That 20, 25%, 30% range for that margin to cover their costs of that sales work and that delivery freight is typical and fair, I think. If it's a retailer who has a DC where they can drop off 100 stores worth of cheese to a single location, well, that just got a lot less expensive for the distributor. They may or may not be actually handling individual store POs. They might just be working with a regional coordinator who's giving them one PO for all the stores, and then they're delivering maybe even a truckload of cheese to a DC, or other, truckload of other products. That's when you can start getting under that 20% margin, and where distributors will have margin agreements with retailers that could get you down to the 10% range. But that is really like full truckload type margins. Usually it's like 12 to 15% for a multi-store retailer, depending on how much store level processing the distributor is doing. But this is like a generic, typical supply chain: 20% for the distributor and 50% for the retailer. That's fair. Okay, so I need a distributor to help me. I'm sick of processing 200 transactions a week. That's what Andy and Mateo and Angie and Victoria, the 2 brothers and their wives who started Jasper Hill, were doing. They were processing 200 transactions a week, chasing 200 invoices, packing 200 little boxes and sending them off to FedEx. It was like killing them. So when they won a big award for the Cabinet Cloth Pound and built this giant aging cave, it was the first time that they were able to get a refrigerated truck to show up and send everything out on one pallet, which just saved so much time that week. They developed relationships with distributors, and then all of a sudden they were doing 3 to 10 transactions a week instead of over 200. So they weren't making as much money, but they were sane and able to get everything done they needed to, and they weren't paying freight anymore. And it turns out that UPS freight is about the equivalent of a 20% distributor margin. So if they were eating freight for their customers, they were basically just tacking on what the distributor margin would have been anyway. So if they stopped paying freight, they just had the distributor come and pick it up from the farm, they could afford to back out that 20% margin and charge the distributor basically 20% less than what they were charging the retailer, and still be just as profitable and have way less of a headache going on. If the retailer all of a sudden isn't paying freight, then, and their true cost, like if you were charging the retailer the true cost of shipping, so you would say, okay, your cheese costs $12.50, and then here's a line item for freight, that really meant that the cost per pound was like $14.50 for the retailer. And then you're on the phone with that retailer every week. They're your buddy, and they love working directly with the farm. And then you call them up and you say, hey, we're bringing on a distributor so that we can have time in our day to hang out with our children. That's kind of heartbreaking for the retailer, right? Like all of a sudden they don't have a direct relationship with you, or feels like they don't. But in reality, instead of spending time chasing them down for money and trying to get them to place their order, you can give them a call once a month and be like, hey, how's it going? Have any feedback? Like have a friendlier, more productive conversation, actually, and by letting the distributor handle all of that, all of the transactional details of the relationship for you. But what you don't want to do is tell them that not only are you not working with them directly anymore, but their price is going up. So my advice to cheesemakers is to bake the freight into the price for the retailer, so that when you're no longer paying that freight, your price is actually pretty static by bringing on a distributor. The distributor can afford to charge that $12.50 and keep that margin. And so your price is coming down, but you're no longer paying that freight. Alternately, your conversation with that retailer is like, well, your true cost was $14.50 or whatever, because you were paying the freight. So the distributor might need to charge you 14 if you can't bring your margin down, but effectively your costs are the same and maybe a little bit lower. Usually you can figure out how to make the price a little bit lower for the retailer by jockeying around with freight costs and your price to the distributor to make that easier. Like, look, this just got more efficient for everybody, and the cheese is going to arrive in better shape, and you can pay the same or less. And that's a much easier conversation to have with the retailer. So as a cheesemaker, it's important to know the future of what your sales might look like and leave room for these margins, and to create communications with the retailer that will make this conversation easier to have if the time comes. And the time usually comes when you need to start working with a distributor, and it's usually a huge relief for the producer. Okay, so how do we figure out what to charge the distributor now? If we know we need to leave them a 20% margin, we want the retailer in this case to keep paying the same amount. What are we going to charge the distributor? We're going to charge them $12.50 times 80%, right? We're going to leave that 20% for them. And so that is $10. All right. So now what's our gross margin on a $10 sale? It's not 80% anymore. It's not 60% anymore. If it costs us $5 to make it and now we're selling it for 10, we're looking at what percent of 5 is 10? 50%, right? So when you're making pallet sales, you're probably looking at a much lower gross margin, but your costs of sales are much, much, much lower. And so this might actually counterintuitively be a more profitable business model for you than trying to sell cheese for $25 a pound, if that makes sense. Okay, so the last thing that we would do is try to figure out, let's say, I get this question a lot. This is the last math equation we're going to do today. We get a restaurant will call us and they'll say like, hey, I saw you on Instagram. I want to buy your cheese. And like, okay, well, we don't send direct to restaurants. We work through distributors. And they're like, okay, well, I want to buy the blue cheese. So how much is that going to cost? And I want to know if I can even put it on my menu and afford it before I go through the trouble of trying to source it from someone. And so I need to give a ballpark cost. Or like I said, I'm trying to extrapolate the suggested retail price, knowing what my end of day price is. Medeo says, you got to charge distributors $10 for this. You need to charge $11.50 in order for us to be profitable. Okay, so what's that going to mean for my SRP? What's that going to mean for what that restaurant's going to pay? They're on the phone with me right now. They want a number. So this is the way the math, this is the least intuitive math, but it's the one that I use the most actually. And once you memorize that little, the equation, it's actually not so bad. Okay, so we need to figure the price to somebody if we know the cost and we know the margin. All right, so what's the total sale price? So in this case, we know that 35% is the gross margin, and we know that the cost is 10, and we're trying to figure out what that total number is. So if, let's see here. So what is the cost? So 10 is what percent of the total, basically. So we're doing, we're trying to figure out what percent of the total $10 is. It's 65, right? So 10 is 65% of what number? This is looking a lot like those fat and dry matter calculations, right? So 10 equals, and the reason this is tricky for me as a liberal arts non-mathematician is that it involves cross dividing in order to isolate the variable, the X, by itself, and all the numbers on the other side, right? So right now we've got a jumbled equation where there's numbers on both sides and a variable, and we're trying to just leave the thing we don't know alone on one side and have it equal just numbers on the other side. We're gonna think back to many decades ago for me in school. Okay, so 10 is 65% of what number? is what we're trying to do here. So 10 equals 1 minus 0.35, right? If we want to turn this into decimals, 10 equals 0.65 times the price, right? 10 is 65% of the total number we're trying to solve. So if we divide both sides by that 65%, we're going to leave that price, that X, that unknown alone. So we're going to divide both sides and we're going to get going to get the number. So if we divide the right side by 0.65, that's going to cancel that out and leave price on its own. And we have to do that to both sides of the equation. So if we divide 10 by 0.65, that's going to give us the price we're looking for, right? And that the answer is 1538. So 10 divided by 0.65 is 1538. So when I'm trying to figure like putting a 20% margin on something, so I have something I know I need to sell to the distributor for 10 bucks. What's the retailer going to pay? The distributor is going to put a 20% margin on that. So if I sell it to the distributor for 10 and I want to put a 20% margin on that, I would do 10 divided by 0.8. Okay, this is the long form math that gets you there, but I've memorized that it's the inverse. It's like 1 minus the gross margin percentage is what I need to divide my cost by. So 10 divided by 0.8 is going to give us that 1250 number, right? Okay, so you might need to watch this a couple times, go through and do the math. There's probably going to be some sample questions coming at you, but the principle of it is we're doing the same thing for fat and dry matter as we are for margin calculations. We're drawing a picture and we're figuring out ratios. We're just figuring out ratios as percent of the whole. They're going to give you all the information that you need to do a pretty simple equation. And if you forget the equation itself, if you can draw the picture and do the algebra, then you can get to the answer. All right. So cost equals 1 minus m%. That's one that I keep in my back pocket, and I do that all of the time. Take the price Mateo tells me I need to charge, put a 20% margin on it, put a 50% margin on it, and I know my retail value, my suggested retail price. Or in the case of the restaurant here, I know I'm going to charge the distributor 10 bucks. I know the distributor has to do a lot more sales work to sell to restaurants who buy less cheese at a time, and usually don't have a consolidated buying warehouse. So you're doing smaller deliveries to more locations. That's going to be more expensive for the distributor to do. So the 35% margin to 40% margin is more typical for what a restaurant margin would be, a food service margin. So if I have that chef on the phone and he wants to know ballpark price for his cheese, I'm going to be like, all right, I charge the distributor 10. I'm going to divide 10 by 0.65, and I'm going to have my number. And I just don't think about it too hard, and I just do that math on my, my calculator all day long. That's my most frequent calculation. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop today. I hope this is helpful. I think understanding just what a gross margin is and being able to figure a margin is an important skill for the test. And if you understand the base principles, you're going to be able to get to that right answer. And remember, it's multiple choice. So there's going to be certain answers that if you even just know the principle without even putting pen to paper, if you know what the principle of they're getting at, a lot of times you can just pick that right answer out because it's in the right ballpark. So thanks for your patience watching a liberal arts grad do a visual representation of of how math works in cheese. I hope it was helpful, and I wish you luck in your studies, and I thank you for your work. It's really important to us at Jasper Hill having people in the supply chain who understand the value of what we do and can communicate it to the end customer and do all of these transactions. They are so much work, and that work is so important. And we really appreciate you, and we want to hear from you if there's anything that we can do for you as you work to prepare or continue on in your cheese careers.